Hello and welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Kendall Bauer, and today's presentation is Part of the Pack, Exploring the Social Lives of Wolves, presented by wildlife biologist Aaron Bott. Aaron, it's great to have you back on the program. I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for joining in today. I'm excited to be talking about the social dynamics of wolf packs. Wolves are a very charismatic species, and in my opinion, I think what makes them very interesting is how they live in these large groups known as packs, and how they survive, and how the dynamics of the pack structure, the composition, can influence their persistence and survival on the landscape. By way of introduction, as Kendall said, my name is Aaron Bott, and I'm a wolf biologist. So I have the incredible opportunity to study and research wolves and monitor wolf populations in the American West. It's been something I've been working on for a very long time. I've had the opportunity to work with a whole bunch of mammalian species here in the western half of North America, and wolves are my specialty. I did my graduate research in Yellowstone National Park, and spent time working in Yellowstone for the wolf project there, and I've worked with several different states as a biologist, researching and monitoring wolves, and I'm currently a doctoral candidate um, doing my PhD on wolves, which I hope to wrap up in the next year or so. Specifically, my research for my doctorate involves looking at pack composition and the impacts of breeder mortality, so breeding wolves on pack structure and also reproduction. So today, and its topic is very relevant to the things that are on my mind as I'm conducting these analyses. I've got some great photos to share with you, most of which are mine that I've taken, but I've also got some photos from a couple coworkers and a good friend of mine, Ronan Donovan, who's a well-known wolf photographer. I've credited some of his photos here. Um, Today we're going to be talking not just about what a wolf pack is, although that's the primary topic of today's webinar. We're also going to talk about how wolves are so successful as a species on the landscape, and they really are. They're truly remarkable. Despite having a long history of persecution by humans, they're still very tenacious, and they're robust, they're resilient. Um, the degree of how resilient they are is sometimes brought into question, and we'll kind of touch on that a little bit. But I always like to begin my presentations by talking about how animals have adapted to their local or current circumstances and environments. This helps us to understand their behavior and why they are the way they are, and appreciate exactly where we are today as we coexist with these animals. I've given quite a few webinars for Natural Habitat Adventures on wolves. I've talked about their hunting, I've talked about their uh, natural history as well as the human history with wolf coexistence, reintroductions into Yellowstone and Colorado, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're interested in some of those topics, I encourage you to get on NatHab's YouTube channel and you can watch some of those. But today specifically, we're just going to be talking about um, wolf social composition and the social dynamics of a pack. And to begin, we need to go all the way back to, like I said, the early wolves, the progenitor to the wolf, those early canids, which actually emerged out of North America and crossed the Bering Land Bridge into Eurasia, where the wolf ultimately evolved and became the wolf that we recognize today. The wolf became a species, Canis lupus, in the Pliocene and into the Pleistocene, when they were not the apex predators that we recognize today. The landscape was very different. The biodiversity on the landscape was very, very different. Um, we had, as many of you know, much larger carnivores, mammalian carnivores that were present on the Eurasian continent as well as the North American continent. such as short-faced bears here in North America. We had many saber-toothed cats. We had a number of um, larger felids, such as the American lion, and we also had the cousin of the gray wolf, the dire wolf, which is pictured here in this wonderful um, paleo bio illustration where wolves are engaging in a conflict, scavenging over a bison carcass with dire wolves, a much larger canine that coexisted with wolves here in North America. It surprises people to know that dire wolves are not just a creature of fiction. They were on average about 150 pounds, and on average, gray wolves today are about 100 pounds. So a bit larger than the gray wolf, and more of a domineering presence on the landscape. So today we recognize that wolves are apex predators. They are one of the world's large carnivores. In fact, they are the largest canine that is alive today, with the exception of a few dog breeds, which we'll get into in just a minute. But they weren't the large apex carnivores during their evolutionary process. And this ultimately worked out to their advantage because being a mesocarnivore or a middle-sized carnivore during the Ice Age, the Pleistocene and the Pliocene, forced them to be very adaptive, and behaviorally they had to be flexible and plastic in order to survive in an environment that was highly competitive. Um, they had to be scrappy, more or less. And this scrappy behavioral trait, this characteristic, as well as living in groups, is what allowed them to outlive all of their larger competitors. At the end of the Pleistocene, a lot of these large carnivores went extinct, such as the dire wolf, and again, the short-faced bear, your saber-toothed cats. And this allowed for wolves to take over the available niche, which was open to them as these other large carnivores went extinct. And wolves then became the top dog. But for tens of thousands of years, again, they had to be scrappy in order to survive and persist on a landscape that was very challenging, very competitive. And one of the best ways to stick up for yourself and for your own survival is to team up with other members of your same species and to work collectively and to cooperate in order to make sure that you are capable of surviving. The cousin of the wolf, the coyote, is now today's mesocarnivore, but it's another primary example of how teaming up and cooperatively working together with other members of your species can be very advantageous. Most of us are aware, and I've given a couple of webinars for NatHab on coyotes and their expansion, but most people are aware that coyotes are uh, more present and prevalent on the landscape today than they were 150 years ago. They're one of those anomalies that, despite massive biodiversity loss across the globe, coyotes are doing great. They thrive in the anthropocentric landscape. But as I mentioned a moment ago, canids are actually a New World species that originated here in North America some tens of thousands of years ago. And during the Pleistocene, these progenitors to the wolf scattered across the globe, going across Beringia, or the Bering Land Bridge, this massive land bridge connecting North America to Eurasia. And as these early canids left North America and went into Eurasia, they adapted to their local climes and they evolved into several different species of canid, but one of those species became Canis lupus, which is commonly known today as the gray wolf or the timber wolf, depending on where you live. This animal then crossed back across Beringia over tens of thousands of years in successive waves, coming through North America and establishing itself basically across the entire northern hemisphere. Therefore, today we've got this phenomenally well adapted, highly flexible animal which at one point in time, not so long ago, basically dominated all of the northern hemisphere, from the British Isles through Scandinavia, through Saudi Arabia, through Asia and Mongolia, through India, across North America. Again, a really remarkable, successful story for this species. And primarily, a lot of this uh, population expansion took place at the end of the Pleistocene, the end of the Ice Age, as niche opportunities, habitat, and environmental opportunities opened up for this animal to make itself comfortable on a landscape that was lacking in large carnivores. And it stepped up to the plate, if you will. So we've had wolves coming and going across this Bering Land Bridge, again, for tens of thousands of years in this process known as biotic interchange. And to put things into perspective, the coyote is the cousin and closest relative to the gray wolf today. Canis latrans is what we call it. And it is actually endemic to North America, which means that it only lives in North America, and now actually is expanding down through Central America as well. But the coyote never crossed over the Bering Land Bridge. It evolved here in North America, and wolves and coyotes are, like I said, the closest of all the canids, genetically speaking, but still there's quite a bit of variation. And my genetics professor would hate for me to oversimplify this, but there's basically a 96% genetic overlap between coyotes and wolves, which is about the same as a human and an orangutan, to put things into perspective. So there's a lot of similarities, but there's also some dissimilarities as well. This map here shows how wolves, again, basically dominated all of the northern hemisphere at one point in time. The lighter gray is where wolves once ranged on this map and now are no longer present due to various reasons, but mostly due to human persecution over thousands of years. Humans and wolves have had a very interesting and complex relationship. Humans have coexisted with wolves for good or for ill for a long time. And in many places, humans have competed with wolves to the point where wolves were locally eradicated. The primary cause for conflict was not only just hunting, but also the development and adoption of agrarian practices, such as livestock husbandry. But it's no wonder that humans all over the globe have a very uh, heartfelt love or hatred of wolves. Everything from Remus and Romulus and the founding of Rome, to the stories of Mowgli in India, to temples of wolves in Japan, to the Norse myths, to the indigenous peoples of North America, to the fairy tales we have. People have been engrossed, at least in the northern hemisphere, with wolves in the background of most of our cultures and most of our stories. And again, that has primarily been detrimental to wolves in a lot of places, and they've been reduced to living in the more remote and complex wild landscapes of our modern world. This is not to say that they can't live in our cities and they can't live in our parks and they are not as adaptive and flexible as the coyote. But we generally don't tolerate large carnivores in those human-dominated landscapes. And so we've kind of pushed them into very wild locations. And now we, unfortunately, I believe, many people just think of wolves as part of a wildness that perhaps is no longer as robust as it once was, when in fact wolves are, again, very adaptive, very capable of living in places where humans do dominate the landscape. Now, to get a little bit deeper into wolves and their social behavior, wolves are a short-lived and fast-paced animal. Their natural history surprises a lot of people because most large carnivores have long lives, and most large carnivores have slow recruitment rates, meaning that they have offspring only once every few years. The offspring are few, and not many of them reach adulthood. Their reproductive maturity is generally tardy, or it takes a long time for them to reach maturation. Wolves are the opposite of this, and this is very fortunate for me as a wolf biologist because the sentiment towards wolves is still pretty hostile in many places. And as most of you know, there have been efforts to help restore and recover wolf populations in areas where they have been removed or eradicated historically. And if it weren't for the biology of this animal, their resilience, I'm not sure that our reintroductory efforts and our recovery efforts would have been successful. But fortunately, these animals just need a half a chance and they can usually run with it. But like I said, this surprises many people because wolves live hot and fast, as I like to say. They come into this world rearing and ready to go, and they quickly expire in many different cases and situations. The average lifespan of a wolf is 2 to 5 years. They can live over 12 years, just like a large dog can, but that's generally not what we see in the wild. It's difficult being a wild animal, especially a wolf, when if people aren't trying to shoot you, your prey are kicking your teeth in or cracking your skull open or breaking your ribs, or other wolves are attacking you and fighting you and challenging you for resource opportunities. So wolves generally don't live very long. They have sexual maturation. They go through puberty at about 22 months, so just shy of 2 years. And this is important because it's going to help us to understand the dynamics of a pack in just a minute. But remember that. So 22 months is generally when a wolf reaches sexual maturity. So they're not capable of reproducing until they're about 2 years old. And their peak fitness is around 3 to 4 years. So if a wolf is 5 years or 6 years, then it's generally over the hill, and its fitness in hunting success and its ability to provide for a pack generally decreases as well. And with this short life cycle, we see on average a wolf generation lasting about 3 years. So every 3 years is typically a wolf's generational cycle. Wolves reproduce just once a year. It's at this latitude here in the northern Rocky Mountain states and Pacific Northwest where I work. It's generally around April when they give birth to a litter of pups. It's usually 5 or 6 pups on average that are born in a litter. And there's a whole bunch of things that impact the survivorship of those pups. But in most cases, usually we only see 1 or 2 pups of that litter survive to the end of the calendar year. That's very circumstantial. It depends on the environment and the resources available for each pack, but we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. So individually, this is kind of what we're looking at for wolves, a very short lifespan, 2 to 5 years. They don't really have the opportunity to reproduce generally before they're 2 years old. And their peak fitness is 3 to 4 years, and they reproduce once a year. So that's their survivorship and their reproduction. Now we're going to take this and we're going to equate it to how they live in a social group. We understand how they evolve to be adaptive, and they evolve to be in groups in order to support one another and help one another. We also understand that individually they might not live very long. So how does this all come to play and impact their social structures and how they live together? Well, ask anybody anywhere in the world what a group of wolves is called, and everyone will probably answer correctly that wolf groups are known as packs. That's pretty common knowledge. People know that wolves live in groups called packs. But surprisingly, a lot of people don't realize that packs are not gangs or mobs of wolves. they're actually family units. They're the basic um, reproductive unit for a group of wolves. And this is fairly interesting and pretty unique on my end as a wildlife biologist, because many of the wildlife species that are managed here in the United States and elsewhere are managed at a level where we have to take into consideration uh, the ratio of sexes on the landscape. And we typically look at polygamous animals living in herd groups. What I mean by that is for most wildlife management, at least terrestrial, on land wildlife management, we're generally looking at deer herds or elk herds where we have large groups of animals living together, typically within the same sex group. And then they have a single reproductive event that takes place each year. And it can be very, you can have a population still be pretty persistent and robust if you have just a handful of males that are capable of breeding with a harem of females. And you can still have high recruitment or reproduction the following spring when all those fawns or all those calves are hitting the ground. And this is, like I said, generally what we see with a lot of our herbivore animals, large mammals like your deer, your elk, your bison, your pronghorn, your bighorn sheep. But wolves are much more complex because of their social structures. Despite having a group of wolves, you might only have one individual within a pack that is a mature breeding male capable of siring offspring within that pack. And so your breeders, your moms and your dads within the pack, are crucial to maintaining structural integrity in your pack. So, at its simplest, a wolf pack is essentially a nuclear family with a mom and a dad, and then several age groups of offspring. And this is familiar to us because we humans also live in these kinds of nuclear family units. Wolves and humans are known as cooperative breeders. That means that our social units, our reproductive units, work together in order to help raise offspring. So, what's pretty special and unique with wolves, as well as with just a handful of other animals in the animal kingdom, is that the males, after fertilizing the females, stick around and ensure that their offspring are capable of growing and hopefully reaching sexual maturity and independence. The females and the males are generally monogamous, so they'll stick together for life. And they will work together in this system of biparental care to help raise their offspring and ensure that their offspring have their best chance of survival and making it in the world. And this is, like I said, unique because in many cases, such as with a large carnivore like the grizzly bear or the mountain lion, after copulation, after fertilization, the males leave the females and they do not participate in the rearing of offspring. But male wolves do stick around. And when the female goes into her den and she whelps, she gives birth to her pups, then the male goes out and he hunts and he swallows food and brings it back to the female and regurgitates it to her. And this sustains her while she's nursing the pups. And a lot depends on that male, especially if it's just a breeding pair, if they don't have other older siblings participating in the raising of the newborn offspring. A lot depends on the male and how successful he is at bringing food home to the female. Females have a high nutritional demand during lactation, and they require a lot of nutrients in order to provide suck for their offspring. And if the male is unable to bring enough food home, then it's possible that the female will dry up and the pups will die in the den. So a lot of pressure is put on that male in this a very complex and really interesting relationship between males and females. Again, it's pretty unique in the animal kingdom to have this kind of working relationship. We also have alloparental care, which is a fancy word of saying non-breeders or non-moms and dads helping out to raise the offspring as well. So in a larger pack where you might have older siblings, those older siblings will go out on the landscape just like dad will, and they'll bring home meals for mom. And then when the pups start growing old enough to be weaned off of their mom and mom goes out hunting, then they all work together and fill up their bellies full of food that they either kill or scavenge, and they come back to the pups and they regurgitate this meat to the pups while the pups are growing throughout the first summer of their life until the pups are old enough and large enough to go out with the rest of the pack and scavenge and participate in hunting. Again, this is somewhat familiar to us, and I think that we often take for granted that we and wolves and just a few other animal species are pretty unique in this kind of complex social structure where we all work together for the benefit of our young, for our offspring, for our siblings, for our children. And this is a pretty cool system. I think it's definitely one of the reasons why humans and wolves have been so intertwined and connected for so long. I forgot to mention earlier, but wolves were the first animal ever domesticated, the first thing ever domesticated, way before we domesticated plants or any other animal species. Wolves were domesticated and they have become our dogs today. I've given a webinar on this and how interesting and complex that whole process was. But I do believe that one of the reasons why humans and wolves have had this long-lasting, complex relationship is because our social systems are very similar. Now, before I continue, I want to say that this nuclear family unit, this reproductive unit that I've just described, is a wolf pack in its most simplistic form. And just like human families are complex, wolf families are also very complex. And sometimes you have not such a simplistic family. You have a more complex family unit where maybe grandma or grandpa lives with the family, or there perhaps are adopted siblings living with the immediate offspring of the parents. And perhaps you might have a stepfather or a stepmother that belongs to the pack as well. Everything really depends to the circumstances of that wolf pack's environment. And things can change pretty quickly, especially, again, even without humans as part of the equation. If a breeding male or a breeding female wolf is killed, that might change the whole dynamic structure of what the pack actually looks like and how it behaves. But like most animals in the animal kingdom, wolves generally avoid inbreeding whenever possible. So males do not breed with their daughters, generally speaking. Females do not breed with their sons, generally speaking. However, there are times when there is some genetic bottlenecking and populations do inbreed, similar to humans. Again, we generally avoid it, but it happens sometimes. Also, we can have promiscuous behavior as well, where if the opportunity presents itself and a Casanova comes into a pack, you might have a female daughter breeding with that other male, and you might have a couple litters of pups being born to a single pack. You might have a female breeding with another male behind the designated breeding male's back, or vice versa. So just like human family relations, wolf family relations can be very complex. And we see more complexity in environments where there are more resources to support larger wolf families, like in Yellowstone National Park. Now, it seems pretty obvious why you would want to live in a group if you were a wolf or any other animal. Again, I think we take for granted the fact that we have this in common with wolves. We live in very complex societies. We live in groups and family units that are cooperative, and we take for granted that a lot of animals don't live in complex social groups. And there are cons as well as pros with living in these kind of social structures. And I'm going to outline a few of those right now. Surprisingly, some people immediately say, well, it makes sense that wolves live in packs because a pack is going to be able to bring down larger prey more easily. Wolves are known for hunting elk. Elk on average are 700 to 1,000 pounds, and a wolf on average is about 100 pounds. Um, so if you're a lone wolf, it's going to be more challenging for you to bring down an elk or even a deer for that matter. Deer are much larger than a wolf is. Bison, of course, and musk oxen, moose, much larger than wolves. But despite all that, lone wolves, single wolves, have been known to bring down even their most formidable prey all by themselves. It's definitely dangerous, um, but it's possible. So perhaps it's best to look at cooperative breeding and the reason why these animals live in groups, um, as being necessary first and foremost to increase the odds of pup survival. Time and time again, we've run analyses in Yellowstone and in the Pacific Northwest and in Scandinavia and elsewhere where we see that there's a correlation between pup survival and pack size. Generally speaking, the larger the pack is, the more resources are readily available to be brought in to support the survival and recruitment rate of the pups. So working together as a team for your primary goal, which is pup survival and reproduction, is perhaps first and foremost why wolves live together in groups. It makes raising pups much easier. If I have just a breeding male and a breeding female working together, trying to start a new family for the first time, it's complicated and it's often dangerous and can result in failure. As I illustrated earlier, if you've got a female who's in the den for the first week to 2 weeks of her life, she depends on that male to bring home food in order to support her as well as the pups that she's providing suck for. It's a lot easier if you've got more individuals in the pack that are bringing home resources in order to support the pup survival. So pup survival is a huge pro for living together in a group. Likewise, foraging, hunting, I'll get into that in more depth in just a minute, but hunting is obviously easier if you're just 100 pounds and you're trying to bring down something that is many times larger than yourself. Working together as a team can be very beneficial, but wolves are also very efficient scavengers. And more often than not, they will try and scavenge on food resources that have already been killed or have already died. And if you have more individuals nosing their way around the landscape, looking for prey to eat or just for scavenging opportunities for food that is readily available on the landscape but doesn't require any hunting effort, if you've got more eyeballs out there looking for that food, then you're going to be more likely to find that food that is there. So having more individuals increases foraging success. And then if you have a larger pack with more individuals, your territoriality is going to increase. You're going to be able to defend your resources that are within your territory more successfully. If you're a small group of wolves living in prime real estate, elk country, the food's great, the country's great, and there's a neighboring pack of wolves that wants your land, they want your resources, they're going to come in and they're probably going to be able to take it from you. But if you have a lot of wolves in your pack, you'll be able to defend your resources in your territory more successfully. We'll talk more about territoriality in just a second as well. Now, there are some major cons with living in groups as well. And the primary one is competition. If you are a yearling wolf and the food is slim pickings, and mom and dad are busy taking care of the newborn pups, and you are supposed to go out and forage and come home, and little brother and little sister look at your jaw, and you throw up reflexively food for them to consume, um, you're probably going to be a little bit grumpy and eager to leave the nest, and you're going to be more inclined to become independent sooner. And this is kind of one of the trade-offs for wolf dispersal. So wolves generally will leave their pack once they reach sexual maturity or before they reach sexual maturity. They leave mom and dad, they leave their pack, and they go off on their own because they have a desire, a biological desire, to go out and start their own family, to attempt to become a breeding male or a breeding female. I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but both males and females often do disperse, so it's not necessarily one over the other. Again, this depends on the environment. In situations like Yellowstone, where there's a lot of resources, we typically see matrilineal behavior with wolves, where the daughters will linger and wait for a breeding opportunity that might become available closer to home. But elsewhere, we do see both males and females dispersing on the landscape. And this is kind of like being at home as a human teenager as well. At some point in time, the benefits of mooching off of mom and dad's refrigerator just aren't quite worth it. And one gets the hankering to go out and to date and to become more independent and eventually maybe even successfully start your own family. Another con is, of course, conflicts. If there are scarce resources, one might not be able to benefit from lingering within that pack's territory. Wolves exhibit what's a pretty interesting and unique behavior known as pups feed first foraging. So again, if food is successfully obtained, a lot of the food is allocated first and foremost to the pups, and the teenagers are more likely to be the ones kind of eating the crust of the pizza without getting the goods. So all of this adds to stress within the pack. And again, that deferred reproduction, which I talked about just a minute ago, might not really be worth lingering around for. And wolves might decide that they want to split and go off and start their own lives. Now, for a long time, we looked at wolf packs collectively, and we referred to them as being a hierarchy or a unit or a group where we had alphas. You've often probably heard people talk about alpha male or alpha female in a wolf pack. And this is misinformation. We as biologists actually do not refer to wolf packs as being hierarchical, and we do not refer to the male breeder as an alpha or the female breeder as an alpha. This misunderstanding took place earlier in the 1900s, when most of what we knew about wolves was from observing um, uh, wolves or wolf packs that were in enclosures or in captivity. And just like going to a dog park, more so, I'm not even going to get into it. It's more complicated with domestic dogs. But if you've ever been to a dog park or taken your dog there, there is a pecking order that is very quickly established among unrelated dogs that are together in a pen competing for resources. But out in the wild, as biologists began to have the opportunity to observe wolves more frequently and more accurately out in nature, the study of ethology, we began to understand that these were simply family relationships. And an alpha generally is a term used to describe a personality. And as we all know, not all moms and dads have alpha personalities. Sometimes those moms and dads can be pushovers. And so describing a breeder as an alpha is inaccurate in most cases. And so Again, as biologists, we typically avoid the term alpha, although that's often bounced around still quite a lot in popular literature. But all wolves have the opportunity, or hope to have the opportunity, again, to become a breeder. So this is not a personality thing, it's not a genetic thing. Wolf packs work and live together. They divide the labor shares in order to successfully work together for their own survival and their own reproduction. And the offspring of a breeding male and a breeding female just defer the time of their reproduction until it's no longer worth sticking around at home, until it's the chances of you going out and being successful as an adult outweigh the advantages of sticking around and again mooching off of mom and dad's refrigerator. So we see this as yearlings get closer to reaching puberty, they'll generally split and they'll disperse and they'll go off to try and find a mate of their own. But meanwhile, while they're within the pack, they're working together and they're dividing the labor. They're sharing the costs of working together and foraging. This is a map I put together, or excuse me, this is a calendar I put together that kind of illustrates what the kind of life cycle of a wolf might look like in its most simplistic form. I'll kind of walk you through this here, but like I said, generally at the latitude that we have here in the western United States, around April, wolf pups are born. Typically, it's a litter of, like I said, 5 to 6, and those wolf pups are very dependent upon their parents and their older siblings taking care of them. In June, the 1st of June, typically the pups are weaned off of mom, and then they leave the den site generally at the 1st of June or the middle of June, and they spend the rest of their summer in several nursery sites that we call rendezvous sites. These nursery sites are where the pups kind of loiter and they hang out. If there's enough pack members, they might have a babysitter while the rest of the pack goes out and forages throughout the summer and brings back food to the pups. And these are where they are centrally located until the pups reach a period of time where they're physically large enough to keep up with the rest of the pack. And that's generally around October and November. 8 to 9 months is when a wolf skeleton stops growing. Again, many of you who have dogs, especially large dogs, you realize that those pups get big very quickly. And even though they still have a lot of mass to put on, a lot of muscle, they're now large enough to keep up with mom and dad. And they might not be very effective at hunting. That's a learned behavior. The predator drive is there, but to become truly successful, that's requires experience and trial and error. They'll typically keep up with mom and dad through the first year of their life, and then in May the following year, April, excuse me, the following year, another litter is born. You get new pups, and now it's your responsibility as the yearling to help bring food back to the den site and to the rendezvous site. And then we typically see an uptick just before puberty, just before sexual maturation, in the fall and into the winter, when yearling wolves decide that it's time to go out on their own and to go off to college, if you will, to go and find a mate of their own. And they breed in February, so just a very short gestation period. The females go through an estrus window that is just a week long. So you've got to make sure you find yourself a boyfriend or girlfriend before February comes along, because if you miss that window, then you've missed your only shot to start a family for the whole year. So the pressure is on to get out there and to find another wolf and to successfully, hopefully, reproduce. Like I said, on average, wolves typically leave their nest, leave their pack before they reach 2 years of age, but some wolves will stick around and stay with their mom and dad and their natal pack, as we call it, for 2, 3, even 4 years before they might leave and go off on their own. So it really all depends on the circumstances that present themselves to the wolves. This is a kind of a fictional map that I created just to illustrate what a den site and what rendezvous sites might look like. So this is an aerial shot, and that star in the bottom right-hand corner illustrates a den site. So typically they'll hang out at a den site from the end of March through April into May and then into June. And then at that point in time, they might up and leave that den site and go find a rendezvous site, the nursery site where they'll take care of the pups. And it might be miles away. And then they might hang out there for a month before they decide to relocate to another rendezvous site. And they typically move rendezvous sites based off of, again, resources, prey availability, and such. I mentioned territoriality. Wolves are very territorial, and they often kill each other, especially in areas where wolves live in highly densely populated regions where there are other wolves. In Yellowstone National Park, where there are a lot of wolves concentrated in northern Yellowstone, one of the primary causes of natural death is territoriality. So a dispersing wolf, one that's leaving its pack, might go off on its own, look for a Juliet, if you will, and walk into someone else's territory and get his tail kicked in. He might get beat up by dad and his brothers. Wolves are very jealous of their resources, and they often will fight to the death over their territories. We call this intraspecific conflict. And like I said, it can get pretty ugly. This is a yearling wolf that was killed by a new group of wolves that came into its territory. Wolves do not cannibalize each other. They just kill each other in defense of their resources. All the scavenging on this wolf that you can see here took place by birds like magpies and eagles and such. Now, again, I mentioned that working together as a team in a pack can be advantageous if you're wanting to defend your resources and your territory. And studies by Kira Cassidy and others from Yellowstone National Park have shown that older wolves, and especially older males or adult males, really influence the outcomes of aggressive interactions. So males are generally larger than females, and so if you have more adult males in your pack, the odds of your pack winning a fight are greatly increased. And also, interestingly enough, wolves that are older in age, even older than 6 years in age, have knowledge in order to help support a pack when it's involved in a conflict with another group of wolves. So if you've got older wolves in your pack, and in addition to having adult males, the odds of your pack winning a fight are greatly increased. I'm going to quickly go through the hunting part. We've sort of talked about this already. Wolves not only select prey based off of their abundance, but also their availability or their vulnerability. Interestingly enough, studies have shown from McNulty et al. That wolf hunting success does not increase necessarily with group size. So if you have large groups of wolves, you're not necessarily going to be killing more animals. This is not an insatiable predator on the landscape. You do have basically a limit to how many wolves a pack can sustain before conflicts become too high. And in this study done by McNulty in 2012, we learned that group success hunting elk peaked around 4 wolves. I should have mentioned this at the beginning. I totally apologize. But on average, wolf packs are typically around 6 individuals. This obviously fluctuates a lot throughout the year, depending on whether or not you just had a litter of pups. But the largest wolf pack that was ever truly confirmed was the Druid Peak pack in Yellowstone, where a couple of different packs joined forces and had multiple litters. That was up in northern Yellowstone. There's a lot of documentaries on them. But that's really an anomaly, again, for multiple reasons, not the least of which is northern Yellowstone has a lot of foraging opportunities and resources for wolves. So most of the time you're looking at a wolf pack that is typically 4 to 6 wolves, maybe 8 wolves. But for hunting elk, group success again peaked at 4 wolves. So if you have 6 wolves, really it's just 4 wolves that are doing the lion's share of the hunting, and 2 wolves are basically mooching off of the others. Um, Again, because males are larger, generally it behooves a wolf pack to have large males because they can kill more efficiently. They use their body weight. They can crush those windpipes. But females, being lighter, are generally better chasers. They're swifter of foot and they're capable of capturing prey better than the males can. I'm going to have to scoot through some of this pretty quickly because we're just about out of time. There's a lot more that I could say about how complex wolf family units are. It truly is a fascinating and really thought-provoking system, and it makes a lot of sense if you think about our own family units and how uh, I've got kids, and I think about how much depends on the success of myself as a parent, and how that's going to influence the survival of my offspring and how they turn out. And um, there are mortalities that take place in the natural world as well as in the anthropocentric world that can drastically influence and impact the survival and the persistence of wolf packs and their offspring. Um, if a breeding male or a breeding female dies at any time of year, that is going to dramatically alter how that pack behaves. It's going to change whether that pack persists, that pack might dissolve. Those pups very well could die depending on the time of year if one of those breeding wolves is killed. You might have high enough wolf density in the area that another wolf will come into the area and become a step parent. Um, or again, everything might completely collapse. This is something, again, that we're very interested in. And because obviously humans coexist with wolves in most places where wolves are, this begs the question of the impacts that humans have on wolves, especially with human-caused mortality, such as poaching or even hunting potentially. Um, if pups die, not to sound macabre, but if pups die, then they die. As I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, pup mortality is generally very high in the natural world. It's just tough being an animal, and it's even tougher if you're a young animal. But if you have a breeder, a breeding male or a breeding female that is killed or dies for any reason, that can dramatically impact the stability of the pack's social structure. And these are things that we have to take into consideration when observing, again, how wolves behave on the landscape and what they actually do for the environment. Um, Many of us are familiar with wolves and the discussion about trophic cascades. I've talked a lot about trophic cascades in presentations on NatHab. It's often oversimplified. It's much more complex. Um, I will say this, though, that it's important for us to realize that wolves are today's apex predators only to a degree. Humans truly are the top dog in almost every environment where wolves live. And even in places where wolves are not being killed actively by humans, things like recreation and human presence can alter the behavior of wolves and their prey and ultimately change ecological the ecological impacts that wolves have on their environment. And so these are all things to take into consideration. And ultimately, they do influence the social structure of these, again, very interesting and very complex animals. This is my last slide. I'm just going to wrap up by saying thank you for tuning in today. I always have so much to say and I always run out of time. But thank you all for joining me, and hopefully you were able to follow some of the things that I was saying. I rambled a little bit, but these truly are an incredible incredible species, and I think it's been a treat to share some of this information with you today. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Aaron. Yeah, this is always a big topic, but a very popular topic, and we had some great questions come in. And I know it's just about the top of the hour, so I just want to remind anyone who can't stick around that we will have the replay available on our website about this time tomorrow, and we'll have a replay email sent out to you soon with that link. And we'll take questions for the next 5 or 10 minutes or so. All right, first question. Actually, there were a few questions about the dire wolves. People are wondering, what exactly happened to them. Um, One question was dire wolves also lived in families, although they needed more food given their larger size. They don't look as dependent on enormous prey as the big cats. So people are just wondering what drove their extinction.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So dire wolves went extinct about 12,000 years ago, and I actually did a webinar, a Natural Habitat Adventures webinar on dire wolves. So if you want, you can get on and listen to me ramble for an hour about dire wolves and their ecology and their behavior. We're not 100% sure what drove their extinction, although it probably had a little bit to do with their dependence as a larger apex predator on their diet. They were perhaps less flexible in their foraging abilities and certainly less tenacious in some behavioral adaptations than the common gray wolf is. But I'm gonna just refer people to check out the dire wolf presentation that I gave because that'll help you out.
Great. Yeah, I'll add that to the replay link that we'll send out so people can have easy access to that. But yeah, you can check out that replay on nathab.com/webinars, and it's going to be under the U.S. National Parks uh, replay. All right, someone had a question here about lone wolves. How common are they? And someone else had asked about lone wolves and if they, perhaps if they were on a ranch and they came across a big dog, how uh, uh, confident are these lone wolves in facing something like that?
So a lone wolf is just a dispersing wolf. It's one of those individuals that is out on its own looking for another wolf to team up with, to mate with. And like I said, it's a very short reproductive season. So if you have a wolf that misses its breeding opportunity in February, and I've got a few of them that I've collared out here where I'm at. I catch wolves and I radio collar wolves and monitor their movements. And in some cases where they're moving into areas where there haven't been wolves for decades, they just wander for a whole year and they look for opportunities to team up with another dispersing wolf. And they don't want to necessarily go into territories that are already occupied because that again could be a death sentence for them. So they wander and wander, but their goal is not to remain as a lone wolf. It's just hopefully a temporary state of existence. Unfortunately, a lot of dispersing wolves do die. They get killed by other wolves, or they get killed trying to bring down an elk by themselves, or they get hit by cars, or they get shot by poachers. So the success of a dispersing wolf is generally pretty low. But again, it's just a phase that they hope to get through. And they're typically young wolves, younger wolves, usually around a year and a half to 2 years of age. They often make dumb mistakes like killing livestock, which gets them into a whole heap of trouble. But it makes sense if you don't have pack members to help you go out and bring down larger food that is more familiar to you. You might be bold and you might go in after something that is tempting and relatively vulnerable, like sheep. Um, so yeah, that's kind of what a lone wolf is in a nutshell. So we get them out on the landscape at any given time of year, especially in the winter, though. Typically, we have about 10 to 15% of our population is dispersing or wandering around trying to find love.
A couple more questions here. The next one is about human management and if anyone who's overseeing these packs ever has any sort of, manipulation or involvement in the pack with like helping out a 2-year-old start a new pack, for example, or are they hands off all the time?
So they're always hands off. I think the closest that you could get with manipulation would be active reintroduction. So in Yellowstone, in central Idaho, and in most recently Colorado, wolves were manually reintroduced. And these are wolves that are captured from areas where there are wolves, and they're generally non-related individuals. So like Colorado just reintroduced 10 wolves. They took them from the state of Oregon, and all 10 wolves that they captured were around the 2 years mark. So just before, as they're reaching puberty, but um, they're not breeders. They're definitely not pups. You want sexually mature individuals that are captured, and then they release them into the wild. And it's like rolling dice. You hope that they find each other and that there's chemistry and that they make babies. And fortunately, it worked. It worked in Idaho. It worked in Yellowstone. Yellowstone was a little bit more complex than that. And it seems to be working in Colorado as well. But that's about it as far as um, being a matchmaker and helping these wolves find one another.
Hmm. That's a really great segue to the last question. Is someone's wondering about your opinion of that reintroduction in Colorado? And I know you did a webinar on this, so I'll include that webinar replay as well in this replay email.
Yeah, thanks for asking about my opinions on the Colorado reintroduction. Again, I spoke for about an hour in that webinar on the Colorado reintroduction, which illustrates all of the nuanced complexity of that whole process. And I'll say that my thoughts are also complex, which is why I did an hour-long presentation talking about it. Um, I think that as a biologist, Colorado is a great place to put wolves. They've got a great prey base, a lot of elk there, more elk there than anywhere else probably in the world. A lot of wild public lands. It's great for the environment, for the ecosystem at large. That said, I'm concerned because people still don't like wolves, and manual reintroduction tends to make it challenging for people to tolerate wolves. But I also don't think that they could have made it there on their own, at least not anytime soon. Despite having some dispersers come from the Yellowstone ecosystem, it seemed unlikely that you'd have genetic integrity with a large enough population of dispersers naturally coming down from Colorado. So I encourage you to watch that webinar and make your own informed opinions.
Absolutely, yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Aaron. I'm going to call it there with questions. This was, again, just another fascinating wolf webinar from you. So I thank you so much for joining us again. I'm going to hand it back over to you for closing comments.
Well, thanks again. Thanks for everyone at Natural Habitat Adventures for helping me share this information. It's a great opportunity to talk to people. I wish that we were doing this in person. I appreciate the questions that were asked. The questions totally make it. Thanks for listening in, and I'll talk to you later.
All right. And my thanks as well to everyone who tuned in today. Join us next week for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out next week's lineup this afternoon, including registration links on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation and we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.